Hello, and welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast, episode 92, The Great Lady. Today, we meet one of Egypt's most enduring names, the Queen Tiye, Lady of the Two Lands, Great of Praises, wife of Amunhotep III. Queen Tiye will be a major force in royal politics, courtly life, and Egyptian social change over the next few decades and episodes. She is arguably the most important queen in Egyptian history, and I am excited to introduce her. Today's episode is brought to you by Sandra Spires, who sponsored the production single-handedly. Sandra, thank you for your generosity. May Isis, the great lady who is cleverer than all other gods and mistress of magic, protect your kingdom. To everyone listening, please enjoy the show. The year was 1399 BCE, around June. King Amenhotep III, Neb Ma'at Re, had been in power for approximately 13 months. The first year had passed smoothly, and the foundations were laid for a prosperous reign. But it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single king in possession of a good kingdom must be in need of a queen. And so it was with Amunhotep. Pharaoh was now about 13 and a half years old. He was rapidly approaching manhood by Egyptian standards. Wasn't it about time he got married? I mean, he wasn't going to be young forever. Amunhotep's mother, Queen Tiye, was aware of her son's impending maturation. Chances are she had been looking around the court and the harem for someone that would suit him as a bride. Now, in Amunhotep's second year on the throne, that bride came forward. In regnal year 2, 1399 BCE, Amunhotep III married a young girl. Her name was Tiye, a very interesting name whose meaning I will return to later. For now, let's meet the lady herself. Tiye came from a family of modest provincial nobility. Not quite blue bloods, but prosperous enough to have some access to the court. At least enough access that, at the right moment, Tiye was there to catch the king's eye, and to become his wife. We're not sure how Tiye and Amunhotep met. The written record tells us nothing of her life before the marriage, and all we have to go on is guesswork. With that being said, it is possible that she grew up in the palace of the royal harem. She may have been one of the children of the nursery who were permitted to live and learn alongside the children of the crown. Then again, it is also possible that she was nobody, and simply came to Amunhotep and his mother's attention by other means. However she appeared, Queen Tiye entered the royal court early in Amunhotep's reign. Before the end of regnal year 2 or so, they were getting married. The most likely explanation for this marriage is that it was arranged by the Queen Mother, Tiye, and Tiye's parents. Then again, if Tiye grew up in the harem, it is also possible that the two young'uns knew each other and were able to form the bond of their own volition. The idea of a love match is not actually that far-fetched, because over the course of their time together, Amunhotep and Tiye demonstrated an extraordinary level of devotion and respect and collaboration. In other words, they seemed like a genuinely affectionate couple. To understand Tiye properly, first we have to start with her name. This is going to require a rare foray into Egyptian grammar, so I hope you'll bear with me for a moment. The name Tiye derives from a particular form of Egyptian grammar which denotes adverbs or adverbial sentences. Tiye, in its basic sense, might be translated as conveying a sense of support, of enhancing or adding to another sentence. In other words, a sense of complementing a more active phrase. So Tiye, used as a name, implies a woman who adds to her husband, who facilitates his actions, who, well, supports what he does. In a sense, Tiye might translate as supportive. You just have to jump through a few hoops to get to that. Funnily enough, none of the scholars that I've read ever bother to translate Tiye's name. Either it's unimportant to their main focus, or they're writing for an audience that doesn't need the grammar explained. Which can be frustrating because a lot of information gets lost when we don't constantly reinforce what certain words, in particular names, actually mean. Essentially, any Egyptian, especially the educated and literate, would intuitively understand that the Queen's name was one which enhanced and added to the majesty of her husband. So when we talk about Tiye, we have to keep that perception in mind. The people who knew her, or simply knew her name, understood her through a particular language prism. So Tiye's name conveyed a public image of her as a supportive wife. Fair enough, that's ancient gender roles in action. But in order to get beneath that propaganda, we have to look to other places. Fortunately, there are a lot more references to Queen Tiye than any other Egyptian queen, and these help to flesh out her status at the court and the place she held in Amenhotep's regime. For one thing, Queen Tiye was not merely a supporting player. Amenhotep often liked to present her as something of an equal. Some years after their actual marriage, Amunhotep honored his wife by issuing a series of proclamations that would wind up spreading throughout the known world. These texts took the form of stone scarab beetles, which were carved and painted with a written inscription on the flat bottom. About 200 of these scarabs survive today, and of those 200, at least 60 are dedicated specifically to Queen Tiye. From these scarabs, we get a glimpse of Tiye's status at the court and the respect which Amunhotep publicly gave her. Quote, "The great king's wife, Tiye, may she live. The name of her father is Yuya, the name of her mother is Chuyu. She is the wife of a mighty king, one whose southern boundary is as far as Nubia, and the northern as far as Naharin." End quote. Now that probably doesn't sound like much to go on, but when we put it into some larger context, you'll see why it's such a big deal. The scarab proclamations of Amunhotep III number about 200. They were produced en masse at the king's behest, and they commemorate different events over the first decade of his rule. We might understand them as some kind of anniversary proclamation, a small reflection on his first decade in power. For instance, those bull hunts that we heard about in the previous episode, that record comes from these scarabs. The building of Amenhotep's grand palace comes from the scarabs as well. There are scarabs recording lion hunts, the building of a lake, at least 2 important marriages, that of Tiye and a foreign princess, and the construction of Amenhotep's great palace at Malkata, arguably the most famous palace ever built in Egypt. The scarabs are an amazing record and testimony of work done in the first decade of the king's rule. The reason that they are also testimony to the status of Queen Tiye is that on almost every single scarab, Tiye is named alongside her husband. So a scarab might open with King of Upper and Lower Egypt, son of Re, Amunhotep, blah blah blah, but they always feature Royal Wife Tiye, may she live. That is not a small thing, that is quite a big thing. Previous wives of kings tended to be rather invisible, and they only gained status when they were mother to the next king, or when they did something significant on their own merit. But Tiye is not invisible. The record of these scarabs tells us that from a very early time in the reign, Queen Tiye was put forth front and center in the royal spotlight. In other words, she was not a background figure, she was an essential component of Amunhotep's regime. On top of this, the distribution of these scarabs made Queen Tiye a very well-known name internationally. The commemorative scarabs of Amunhotep III have been found throughout Egypt, of course, but they also show up in settlements in Canaan and Syria, and even Crete. As royal agents or trading ships traveled throughout the Near East, the Mediterranean, and even the Aegean Sea, scarabs of the great Pharaoh and his wife traveled with them. Today, these are a physical record of a network which connected Egypt with lands far away. Tiye's name traveled to those lands. I'll return to the scarabs again periodically as we continued through the reign. For now, let's get into what Queen Tiye actually did at the court of the king. Queen Tiye took on many titles in her lifetime. Apart from the usuals like royal wife, Hemet Nesut, and royal ornament, she also took on roles that conveyed a sense of authority over the whole land. Over the course of her life, Tiye became known as the hereditary princess, or Irit Pat, the lady of the two lands, Nebet Tawi, and the mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt, Henut Sekhmahu Mehu. Prestigious titles which made her at least as well known as her husband. She was a complement to his majesty, sure, but she had her own special luster. Later on in the reign, we'll even see her getting her own temple, where she would be worshipped as a living goddess. Tiye started out as a wife, but she became divine. Apart from the titles which convey authority or simple prestige, Tiye also has a number of titles which hint at her relationship with Amunhotep himself. According to her various epithets, Tiye and Amunhotep were quite close. You see, Tiye is also known as the Sweet of Love, Benret Merut, the king's wife, his beloved, Hemet Nesut Merit F, and the Great of Praises, Weret Hesiut. These titles give us a sense that Amunhotep valued his relationship with Tiye, and that they cared for one another. Essentially, that she was a person celebrated in the court for her own merits. So we get little glimpses of what these two felt for one another. Again, this will only get stronger as we go further down the road. Queen Tiye would accomplish great things in her lifetime, and her name would become legendary among royal women. But at the start of their life together, Tiye and Amunhotep's ambitions were a lot more modest. Initially, they had one expectation above all others. They needed to produce children. Amunhotep III and Queen Tiye married when they were on the cusp of puberty, or just starting it. Around regnal year 2, Amunhotep was probably about 14 years old. Queen Tiye was maybe 12 or so. So it wouldn't be long before they were physically capable of producing children. Soon enough, that process began. Somewhere around regnal year 4 or 5, when she was approximately 15 years old, Queen Tiye gave birth to a son. This son was named Thutmose. He was the first son of the new king, and he was the new heir to the throne. So naturally, he was named after Amunhotep's father, Thutmose IV. The tradition of naming the first son after his grandfather was alive and well under Amunhotep III. So Thutmose came into the world destined for the throne. One day, assuming that he survived childhood, he would become Thutmose V. The court rejoiced at the birth of a son. The inheritance was assured. Amun and the great gods had clearly blessed the union of Tiye and Amunhotep, and the longevity of the royal line was safe for another generation. But of course, one child is never enough for a royal family, so others followed soon after. In regnal year 5 or 6, Tiye gave birth to a daughter. Her name was Sat or Siat Amun, aka daughter of Amun. Considering how the pharaoh Amunhotep claimed to be Amun's literal son, this seems like the legend of divine conception and pregnancy was alive and well. Siat Amun was a new manifestation of the line. Siat Amun shows up quite a lot in the written record. She became particularly well associated with her maternal grandparents, Yuya and Chuyu. She lived for at least 30 years, and we'll see her again later on in the reign. In quick succession after Siat Amun and Prince Thutmose, perhaps one every year or 2 years, Amunhotep and Tiye produced another 4 children. Son number 2, named Amunhotep, followed around year 7 or so. Then 3 more girls, Henut Ta-Neb, or Mistress of all lands, Iset, or Isis, and Nebet-Ach, aka Lady of the Palace. All of these girls would play some kind of role in their father's regime. Once again, we'll meet them later. The family of Amunhotep III and Queen Tiye was large, and became a central part of the king's public representation. The eldest son, Thutmose, would become a high priest by the age of 17 or so, and he would play an important role in a new religious cult. The daughters Sit Amun, Henut Tarneb, and Iset would all participate in their father's greatest celebrations and ceremonies, and the mother Tiye would preside over the most well-documented and active royal family that we have seen since the Old Kingdom. So yeah, the family which Tiye and Amunhotep made together was going to play a big role in the years to come. Now, around 1399, when we began this episode, all of those children were still in the future. Amunhotep and Tiye married at a young age, and a powerful new stage in the royal bloodline was forged. But one of the most fascinating things about this marriage is that it was a new bloodline. Queen Tiye was not a relative of the royal family. As far as we can tell, she came from a place very far away from the royal palace. In order to understand Tiye's rise and her place in the court, we need to, as they say, meet the folks. Queen Tiye came from a family of minor nobility, provincial nobles who somehow found themselves at the royal court. Her father was named Yuya, her mother was named Chuyu. Yuya and Chuyu, often called Yuya and Tuya for the nice rhyming sound, are a mysterious but fascinating couple. Yuya and Chuyu came from a small town in Middle Egypt, where they served in official capacities as members of the administration and participants in the local temple. Yuya, the father, was a hem-netcher or priest of the god Min. He was also an overseer of cattle belonging to that god. In other words, he was an administrator and celebrant in the temple of Min, which was located in his hometown. These functions were complemented by those of his wife. Queen Tiye's mother, Chuyu, served in the temple of Min as well. Her titles, though, are quite varied. At one point or another, Chuyu served as a singer of Hathor, a priestess of Amun, the chief of the entertainers or musicians of Amun, and finally as chief of the entertainers of Min. In other words, Chuyu was an active member of her local religious community, and she derived much of her status from working in the temple of Min. These responsibilities were not just religious, though. She also held titles of economic importance. Apart from being a singer or chief of musicians, Chuyu also held the title Mistress of Robes in the temple of Min. Now this is more important than it sounds. Every god was worshipped via a divine statue. Every day, that statue needed to be washed, anointed, and given new clothing. The clothing of a god had to be high quality. Only the finest linens were acceptable. Chuyu, the mistress of robes, may well have been responsible for sourcing the linen which clothed the statue of Min. Overseeing linen and textile production was an important cog in the machinery of a community. A god needed offerings. He also needed worship and clothes. Chuyu provided one of those components. Her husband, meanwhile, was the overseer of Min's cattle, which means that, together, Yuyu and Chuyu were responsible for maintaining part of the wealth of the temple. Add to that their roles as priest and chief of musicians, respectively, and you have all three components of worship covered. Basically, Yuya and Chuyu were the pivot around which the day-to-day running of their local temple moved. If the Temple of Min is a corporation, they were the ones who made it work. So Yuya and Chuyu were important people in their hometown. As for the town itself, well, we know a surprising amount. The town where Yuya and Chuyu worked, and where Tiye grew up, is today known as Akhmim. Akhmim was a town of miners and weavers, with linen production and quarrying being the major industries. The patron god of Akhmim was, as you can guess, Min, whose temple where Yuya and Chuyu worked was probably the largest in the region. Min, lord of procreation, was a powerful figure. He protected those who travelled into the eastern desert, especially miners and those going to the Red Sea. He also encouraged sexuality and fertility between couples. Men's symbols were the bull, the ram, and, quite possibly, the constellation Orion. Men helped kings to father their children. He helped the virgin soil to bring forth new life, and he helped women to conceive their offspring. He was an important god, and those serving him enjoyed a privileged status in their community. So that's what we know of Tiye's parents, at least their origins. A little bit down the road, we'll have a chance to explore Yuya and Chuyu's life at the court of the pharaoh, and how their new relationship with Amunhotep changed their lives. On top of that, we'll get to explore a rare find, the tomb of Yuya and Chuyu, discovered in the early 20th century, almost completely intact. The tale of Yuya, Chuyu, and their daughter Queen Tiye will continue soon. For now, it's time to wrap up this week's episode. In 1399 BCE, Queen Tiye and Amunhotep III married. A pair of pre-teen monarchs, they found themselves in a bond that was going to last for the rest of their lives. For the next 36 years, Tiye and Amunhotep would form an inseparable power couple. Their names and their fame would spread throughout the known world, and their legacy would become one of the most enduring in all Egyptian royalty. The love which Tiye and Amunhotep shared, or claimed to share, was expressed in many public forms. Whether it was the grandiose titles of Tiye, or the scarabs which proclaimed her name far and wide, the records produced at this time tell us of an incredibly powerful and influential couple working together to rule Egypt. Over the forthcoming episodes, we are going to see statues, paintings, stelae, and even temples and palaces erected to their shared glory. For a pharaoh and his queen, any display of affection was also a good opportunity for some large-scale public projects. So the tale of Amunhotep and his great Queen Tiye begins here, with their marriage and the start of their relationship. But, being mid-February and all that, it's worth asking ourselves, how did the ordinary Egyptian express their love? Now that we're firmly into the second half of Dynasty 18, the time has come to start looking at some written records of Egyptian romance. So join me next week for a mini-episode exploring Egyptian poetry and tales of the heart. Love Songs, releasing February 26th. See you soon.